Good morning, everyone. My name is Krista Lopez. I work for the General Land Office, and I'm going to be facilitating the conversation around the housing module. So first I want to go through a baseline and talk about how do we get to a housing program for disasters? How does it all come to be? And want to talk about how we're going to talk through the modules today. So the first module, the intro session, we're going to talk about federally funded disasters versus non-federally funded disasters, because that question comes up all the time. How do we find resources and identify support within our communities for disaster housing, especially when there isn't a federal declared disaster or there's not a federally funded housing mission? Then we're going to move into short-term housing. So let's say there is a federally funded mission. What does that short-term housing mission look like, and where are the opportunities within that mission? Intermediate disaster housing, we're going to talk about what does that look like and how long that might last. And then we're going to talk about long-term housing recovery. And then finally, we'll wrap up. So how do we get to a housing mission? So we obviously begin with a disaster. An incident occurs. The local jurisdictions continue to assess the damages within the jurisdiction. They submit their local disaster declarations. They submit their letter to the governor. They also submit their disaster summary outlines that give a picture of how many units or how many housing areas have been affected, what type of level of damage. And then from there, the state makes a determination if they're going to declare. In that declaration, there's also damage assessments that are concurrent with FEMA and SBA to determine if it even warrants a state disaster declaration request up to the federal level. When that federal disaster declaration request is submitted to the president, it includes data such as the number of homes impacted, what level, what type of resources are within that community. So for example, if you have a metro area that has a lot of rental resources, that's important to include. If it's a more rural area that was affected, that's also important to include, because that tells you what type of rental resources might be available for those folks that need an alternate place to stay in the interim while they rebuild their home. From there, if a federal disaster is declared, then there's a conversation with the state regarding what type of resources might be turned on. So for each disaster, it's going to look differently. And we're going to move into the IA sequence of services to talk about how that difference might be. This is in your IA guidance that just got released this month. So if you haven't seen the new IA guidance from FEMA, please take a look at that. But when a disaster occurs, the first service, and actually, ironically, the last service that households receive, is voluntary agencies. They play a magnificent role in helping our local survivors respond to, recover from. They provide resources for mass care. They provide resources for rebuilding, mucking and gutting homes. So we would be remiss if we did not include voluntary agencies throughout this entire process. Most of what our households are receiving as far as services often come from a voluntary agency, donated resources and goods, so they do play a big role. In addition, at that same time that our voluntary agencies are providing support to households in disasters, they're also receiving insurance information. And if they have homeowners insurance or renters insurance, they're now tapping into that resource. So those are the first two waves of assistance to households. The next wave is if there's a federal disaster declaration, homeowners are replying with FEMA for assistance. They're calling 1-800-621-FEMA, and they're registering with FEMA through that method or through the app or through disasterassistance.gov. At that point, FEMA sends an inspector out to their home. And that's what determines what level of housing assistance, FEMA assistance, that they'll receive. The state-run ONA program also begins to kick in, and ONA is the Other Needs Assistance Program. And then the household is encouraged to apply for SBA. And there are different programs that households might be eligible under ONA, depending if they applied for SBA or not, and if they were eligible for this Small Business Administration loan or not. And then from there, they get back, as I mentioned, to the beginning, to the voluntary agencies who are now facilitating the long-term recovery groups and the unmet needs committee. So it really does come full circle to our voluntary agencies, and they play a big role in disaster housing. I wanted to provide this framework and this foundation because that's the key that leads to everything else along the way. So housing assistance. As I mentioned, households will register with FEMA. They have a FEMA inspector assigned to the household, and they schedule an appointment with that household. The inspector comes out, and what they're looking for is level of damage. So for example, if it's a flooding event, they're looking at what level did the water come into the residence. Was it just under the base of the home, if it's a Pier and B home? If it's at a slab foundation home, was it just at the slab? Or was it above the outlets? That makes a big difference. So if water has risen above the electrical outlets in a home, then that probably leads to damage to the electrical system of the home. That's a much higher value as far as damage to the home than if it's below those electrical outlets. So they're looking at depth of water damage, or if it's a tornado event, they're looking at how many structural elements of the home have been damaged. So is it missing a roof and a wall? Is it missing 2 walls or 3 walls? That's a big piece of it. Tornadoes are also tricky. The inspectors are looking at, was the house moved? Van Zandt County, February of 2017, we had the tornado that came through there. We went out, we looked at a home, it looked completely intact until we walked around the backside of the house, and all the plumbing was laid out on the ground. Well, it wasn't laid out on the ground, the house was actually lifted up and shifted 10 feet forward from the exact location it had been laid. So inspectors are looking for all that information to gather and assess what level of damage has been to that home. Once they determine the level of damage, the inspector goes back and inputs that data into a calculator. There's a separate group at FEMA that determine, based on that assessment, what the FEMA verified loss is for that home. So you often hear the terminology FVL, that's the FEMA verified loss. This is a key factor if there is a direct housing mission. So for Hurricane Harvey, we had a direct housing mission that included travel trailers, MHUs, home repair, and so forth. That FVL, that FEMA verified loss, played a big role in that eligibility. So anyone over $17,000 in FEMA verified loss might be eligible for a direct housing mission if that's turned on for the disaster. Anyone under $17,000 might be eligible for something like the PREPS or the STEP program, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. FEMA also checks a little bit as they're walking through the homes to see what type of damage was done to personal property. That's not their primary goal, but that helps inform the Other Needs Assistance Program. And that ONA is distributed in Texas by the Health and Human Services Commission. So HHSC administers that program. FEMA will typically issue a check to a household for their IA repairs or their repair funds. They will issue a check via direct deposit. That's important because you'll often hear scammers and households in disasters say, someone offered me a FEMA check, or they knocked on my door and said, I can give you your FEMA check now, I just need a $50 check deposit. They make up all sorts of stories to give someone their money early. All households typically receive a direct deposit. ONA is separate. HHSC typically mails a check to that household. So you may also get questions from households saying, I received a check in the mail from the state of Texas. And you're thinking, we didn't send you anything. It truly does come from HHSC. So they will get a warrant or a check from the state of Texas for their ONA funds. So there are 2 different ways that they receive funds. In addition, households can apply for SBA, and we'll talk about that in a little bit and what that process looks like. So non-federally declared disasters, let's hit on that for a little bit. So a local jurisdiction, they submit their DSO, their letter to the governor, and their disaster declaration. Maybe a joint preliminary damage assessment or PDA with FEMA and the state and SBA is not warranted. Maybe because it's just 1 county, or maybe it's 2 counties and we don't believe it's enough to warrant a disaster declaration request at the federal level. There is an option to request an SBA declaration, and this is an important one. So the state, along with SBA, can go to that jurisdiction. And if there is a minimum of 25 homes that meet what's called the major category, so think back to the water above the outlets, or in a tornado situation, 2 structures of the building missing, that would be in the major category. SBA is looking for at least 25 of those homes in the major category without insurance. If a county has that, then they can receive an SBA declaration for that county. A lot of jurisdictions will say we don't want to go through the fuss of that, we don't want to go through the hassle, our homeowners aren't going to take advantage of the loan. My response to that typically was, why not give them the option, first off, because maybe they will take advantage of it. SBA loans are low interest loans. Minimum is, I believe, $20,000 that they have to take out. However, that's paid out over 30 years. So if you think about a low interest loan on $20,000 over 30 years, that's a fairly minimal payment, but that helps somebody put a new roof on their house. That might help them rebuild their home. So there's a benefit to it if they're eligible. The other benefit of asking for an SBA declaration for a county is it turns on other state programs. It alerts TDHCA with their homes program. It might alert the rural development loans. They can also turn on and provide assistance for those jurisdictions. So there are several things that can come about as a result of an SBA declaration. So I encourage folks not to kind of dismiss that option, but that is something out there. In addition, non-federally declared disasters often draw the attention of local jurisdiction, voluntary agencies, civic organizations. And that's where having established voluntary agencies within communities is really helpful. We often talk to communities about having not just their long-term recovery group after a disaster, but then transitioning that into an existing civic organization that will then last through the time period for that jurisdiction. That way, if they do have a secondary disaster that's smaller in scale, they can support it at the voluntary level. So that's for non-federally declared disasters. As I mentioned, voluntary agencies do play a big role. It's important to keep them engaged, it's important to keep them around, and they do matter so much in the housing recovery side. The long-term recovery committees can be civic organizations in Blue Skies, but we also want them to have the knowledge and the experience to manage donated funds and resources, as well as emerging volunteers. So think to the Central Texas flooding in the fall. There were a number of voluntary agencies that showed up to assist those households after the flooding event. You want to make sure that that's organized. You want to make sure that that's captured. It's also important to capture that voluntary effort for the potential cost match if there's a PA federal declaration. Voluntary agencies are there from the onset, and as I mentioned earlier, they're there at the end. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're thinking about disaster housing, how to manage the voluntary agencies. So in the jurisdictions, in the local jurisdictions and also at the state level, what are some of the challenges when we think about a federally declared disaster and then a non-federally declared disaster? So in a federally declared disaster, it could be overwhelming number of houses impacted versus in a non-federally declared disaster, you could have the challenge of not having enough to meet that federal level. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there. So think about how dynamic our metro areas are becoming and how the urban sprawl is impacting city planning as well as urban growth. That impacts your available rental resources, that impacts the number of households that might be impacted. So it's certainly, having an idea of what that looks like prior to a disaster can really be helpful in expediting resources later on. If a jurisdiction is not aware of the housing resources they have on stock, and now they're come upon a major disaster declaration, they may be behind on planning for how to support all the housing needs in that community. The DSOs and getting ready to submit that information is absolutely essential, and having personnel there to support in doing so. I always encourage the jurisdictions when I was out talking to them, if there are staff that are already responding to the disaster, so your fire departments, your police, your EMS, if they're already in the field responding to the initial event, why not train them ahead of time to know how to do a windshield assessment. So as they're out rescuing households, they can also capture, okay, we went down Pine Street and there were 10 houses that had 5 feet of water. That's going to help the local jurisdictions capture their DSO information. So proper training and preparedness can also help the housing mission. One of the other challenges we see in a direct housing mission, if that's warranted during a federal disaster declaration, is permitting. We saw this over and over again during Hurricane Harvey. One of the initial challenges we faced was electrical permit pole or electrical power poles. Each house had to have a separate power pole if they were receiving a temporary housing unit. Each power provider had their own definition of how tall that power pole had to be. So, and how tall the meter on the pole had to be, more specifically. So, and you know, Encore might have wanted 12-foot power poles and the meter to be at 10-foot high, but another provider might have wanted, City of Austin might say, no, we only require our meters to be at 6 foot. So that became an issue for vendors trying to expedite placing housing units when we had to look at differences in those ordinances. Differences in HOA or POAs versus non-HOA communities. So an HOA is a private governing body that has its own legal statutes. So they can say, I don't care if you live in Harris County and they're allowing people to have temporary housing units. You live in our HOA, therefore you can't have one because it's against our rules. So understanding ahead of time for jurisdictions, what will your decision be about a housing mission? What are the gaps in resources and services? And then also, what are some of the local nuances, whether it be HOAs, private power authorities, or other permitting issues that might come up during a housing mission, and iron those issues out ahead of time. That will help expedite services. One of the things we found too is some jurisdictions don't even require permits for temporary housing, whereas some counties actually require 5 or 6. So having that streamlined across the state when you're servicing multiple counties can also be helpful. So we'll start with second module, and we're going to talk about short-term recovery / short-term recovery housing. And this is those days and weeks following a disaster. So think about as soon as an incident occurs, you already have a housing need. And housing is typically in this mindset, in this span, housing is mostly mass care. It is your sheltering operations and so forth. So here, again, I want to remind folks and want to hit this home to all of our public as well, insurance is always the first round. Having insurance will help expedite and serve our individual homeowners when it comes to disaster recovery housing. One option following a disaster might be sheltering at home. We found this during the past several years of events. Some homeowners would rather live in their home, on their property in a tent so they can protect their property versus leaving their property and going to a shelter that's been established for the community, or even leaving to go stay with family and friends. Family and friends are also another option. Texans are resilient, so either we're going to stay on our property and protect our property, or we're going to go live with our family because family is close, our friends and family are supportive, and they're there. What we have found in long-term disaster housing is staying with family and friends is a good option at the beginning. But at some point, at some time, everybody gets a little cranky. It's very rare that people can exist 12 months later with their in-laws or with their friends who they were best friends with. We know that that's kind of what we think we're going to do, but it's not the ideal circumstance. It is a temporary housing service. The other option is staying in hotels, which are paid for by the survivor. So sometimes survivors have enough financial means that they can put themselves up in a hotel for a few days. Or if they have that element written into their insurance rider, that they will have temporary housing paid for by insurance as they recover from a disaster. That might be an option. Very few people have that. It's not something that most people think about asking for. It's similar to if you have car insurance and you opt into having rental insurance, so you have a rental car if you get into a car accident. It's the same thing on your homeowner's side. You can look to see if they can provide temporary housing assistance if something happens to your home. One of the other housing assistance options is TSA, or the Transitional Shelter Assistance Program. That's if it's a declared disaster federally and if it's warranted. You don't see TSA turned on often for disasters, but when you do, there needs to be parameters about how long that program's going to last. And FEMA determines who's eligible for that program, and each week and each month set different goals for how to narrow that program down. So as soon as there's a plan for how to turn the program on, there should be a demobilization plan of how to exit out of that program. And then again, in this short-term phase, we have voluntary agencies again assisting with muck and gut and debris clearing. We also have our traditional shelters, and I didn't throw those on the slide, but those are an important piece to all of this. But again, those are typically only aimed at a few days of support. When you have a large-scale event, sometimes the timelines on all of these stretch. So as I talk about the short-term timeline and I get into intermediate and long-term, one of the things you're going to see is it's going to vary. So if it's an event the size of the Halloween floods in 2015, and we had about 10 counties and it was manageable, compared to a Hurricane Harvey, when you have 41 individual assistance declared counties and 31 receiving housing mission. Those are very different events with different timelines, and some of these timelines, these events might be concurrent. So although ideally we keep everybody in shelters and then we transition into something else, there's often an overlap between those. So sheltering versus housing. This early phase, that's kind of a blend. Most of it is considered sheltering. So for example, obviously as we talked about regular shelters, hotel is a shelter option, is a form of housing, but still sheltering. PREPS, this is the partial repair for essential power and services. This is the program that we had during Hurricane Harvey. We saw a program similar to it, Shelter at Home, or STEP in Louisiana and New York. It's also rolled out into Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria and some of the other subsequent disasters. This program's goal is to get individual households who have that FEMA verified loss, that's where that FVL of under 17,000 comes into play again. Those under a 17,000 FEMA verified loss, this goal of this program is to get them back in their homes as quickly as possible, where they can then begin rebuilding their homes themselves. So the goal of the program is to provide safe, sanitary, and secure. Do they have one bathroom with a door, with a functioning commode, sink, and shower? Do they have a functioning kitchen with a surface to cook on and a refrigerator? So we were able to provide mini refrigerators and 2-burner hot plates with a countertop. If you look over history of the STEP or PREPS program, when it first started, it literally was 2x4s and a piece of plywood and a cooktop on, a 1-burner hot pot. Now it's expanded to where it's actual cabinetry. It may not be cabinetry that matches the rest of the house. It may not be cabinetry that they keep, but it is solid cabinetry. It's not just a bunch of 2x4s. It is not replacing all the drywall. It is actually replacing drywall up to the height of outlets and covering any wiring in house for safety reasons. It is enclosing 1 bathroom and it is enclosing 1 bedroom. And then the bedrooms might increase depending on household size. So household size plays a factor in disaster housing. We use the HUD standards for housing. So for example, if it's Chuck and his wife in the house and they have a 4-bedroom house and their house is destroyed in a disaster, Chuck and his wife need 1 bedroom, according to HUD. But if it's Chuck and his wife and they have a boy and a girl and one's 15 and one's 18, then that's a 3-bedroom minimum standard home to repair. It depends on the age and the gender as well as how many people are in the home. So that is a factor on how many rooms are repaired. Again, voluntary agencies pop up again. And then during this phase, we're also preparing for a potential housing mission if one's warranted. So in the spring of 2016, we had back-to-back disaster declarations. We had 3 in a row. And one of the areas that was impacted greatly during that event was Brazoria County and several other counties around Brazoria. And they were in line to get a housing mission, and then it was reviewed once again, and it was not awarded. So they were on that cusp. So you're always potentially preparing for a housing mission, even though one may or may not come about. Because FEMA sends out a disaster housing assessment team. They look at those available rental resources. They look at what services are available to households to rent, as well as apartments, maybe extended stay hotels, sheltering options, so forth. So they explore all the other options. And the rule of thumb for FEMA is there enough available resources within a 50-mile radius? That's negotiable though. And the reason it's negotiable, because how many of you think 50-mile radius is reasonable within Houston? That commute time would be huge. So we have to think about how much time would it take individuals to get to work? Because the last thing we want to do is place someone in a housing unit that then takes them out of work, removes their kids from their school system. That's the point of last resort if we have to. Because ideally we want to keep folks employed, we want to keep them close to the resources and the community needs that they have, their pharmacies, their doctors, and so forth. But this is all in that preparation phase for a housing mission. And again, we get to the identifying rental resources. So challenges during this phase. What are some of those challenges? You're in a short term. This is days and weeks after an event. Let's talk about a small scale disaster first. So this is, let's say, 10 counties in Texas that are affected by this disaster. So number of people, demographics, and animals. We know that folks aren't going to move far from their pets or not go someplace where they can't take their pets. So we have to have a plan for their animals in place. Whether that be livestock or domestic pets, we have to have a plan for them because they are part of the family in many households. Let's talk about a disaster that hits 40 counties. So you're going to end up with households that end up hundreds of miles away from their home. What happens if that happens in August, right before school starts? And the kids now have to pick up pick up school in a brand new school in a new school district, and the schools in that area have to absorb it. So they weren't prepared. They didn't get affected by a disaster, but maybe now Fort Worth is now absorbing new kids into their school system, or maybe we're sheltering people in Temple, and folks are in hotels in Temple, but there aren't any resources in those hotels for people to cook. So where are the people going to eat? They don't have enough money. They just lost everything they have. They don't have any food. So how are they going to eat in that time? Are you coordinating with your voluntary agencies to do feeding stations in non-declared counties near those sheltering operations? Those are all the things to think about during this phase because this impacts your housing operations. It also changes depending on location of the event. So think about that. Did it hit the Dallas Metroplex? Did it affect the Central Texas area? Is it in the Valley? Is it in West Texas? Is it in the Hill Country? Those are the type of things to think about. Last thing to think about in this, and this came up during Hurricane Harvey, we were already servicing a community in temporary housing units when Harvey hit from a past disaster. So you have to think about, are there still people living in temporary housing units from a previous disaster who are now going to be affected by this disaster? And that's something to consider. And do you know where those housing units were? Module 3. So this is the challenge. This phase is very difficult because this is where news media is going to get a hold of you and say, why haven't you helped these people yet? If it's a large-scale disaster and it's a big housing mission, folks are going to want to know, why hasn't everyone been served yet? And we've talked about all the challenges so far. We've talked about permitting. We've talked about knowing what available rental resources are out there, getting a federal disaster declaration, getting a housing mission within that declaration. All those pieces have to come into place to get us to an intermediate housing recovery section. If this isn't a federally declared disaster, you still have folks that are going to take a year to rebuild. Prior to Hurricane Harvey, there were 7 SBA declarations in Texas for individual counties. Some were in the Panhandle, one was in Hillsborough area. They were all throughout the state. And I think about all those individual counties who were trying to rebuild and recover, and then the state resources get sunk into Harvey. And so think about the dynamic nature of having other events happen on top of still trying to move into this. So now we're in intermediate recovery. This is months into probably the first year, year and a half of disaster housing recovery. Still, insurance. Insurance takes a while, especially if it's a large-scale event, especially if it takes the insurance companies a long time to determine, was the house covered or not? Were the contents covered, but maybe not the structure? Was the structure covered, not the contents? The other piece of this, and we didn't talk about during the short term, is during that short-term phase, if it's a flooding event in Texas, it's quite possible FEMA inspectors have not gone out yet. It's quite possible insurance agents haven't gone out yet. And that's because it's probably still flooded. One of the delays during Hurricane Harvey was grounds were saturated. There was still standing water in so many areas that it was difficult to get back to the house for their first inspection to determine what their FEMA verified loss was, to understand what damages they had. So if FEMA can't get back there, neither can your insurance agents. So that's something to consider. Sheltering at home is also still an option. This is, again, that shelter at home preps program, probably in the first few months, not hopefully, a year and a half later, but folks might still be sheltering at home. They might be rebuilding while deciding to live in their home. I know a lot of folks still from Hurricane Harvey are living in the second floor of their home, and then they're rebuilding the first floor of their house because the second floor of the home was perfectly fine. And they're just taking their time to rebuild the first floors. They have means and resources. This is where staying with friends and family is starting to get old for a lot of households. This is where, we've worn our welcome out, and it's time to find other resources. And TSA is probably dying down, and the direct housing mission is probably starting to ramp up. Okay? So we saw more sheltering stuff. We're now weaning out the sheltering, and now we're moving into the direct housing mission. Again, you might have some overlap with some of this, and a lot of it determines how quickly assessments and inspections can be done on homes to determine what they're eligible for. Many households will also appeal their FEMA inspections and ask for a secondary inspection, which may delay knowing what program they fit in, because you certainly don't want to start repairing a house for preps only to find out later they might have been eligible for a direct housing mission assistance. So you have to weigh that timeline as well. So housing. Folks who decide to rebuild, those people whose homes are not habitable, safe, sanitary, and secure, they'll continue to rebuild as time goes on, but they also have to determine, do they want to rebuild quickly or not? So for example, if a household decides to rebuild, let's say a year after a storm hits, and then 6 months later, the jurisdiction now remaps and their house has to be elevated, they may have just rebuilt only to have to tear down what they just rebuilt. So that's something to consider in housing. Is there's a big push emotionally and from the media to get homes rebuilt. But sometimes by doing so, we actually cause more damage to the households because they may have to rebuild after all because they had to elevate or because they're being bought out or something along those lines. Again, when there's not a presidential disaster declaration, hopefully there's insurance. Talk to Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs about their homes program. They sometimes have some housing vouchers. They might have some disaster assistance funds available. Local nonprofit housing providers and developers, there's often a big pool of resources in large-scale disasters. This is smaller in a smaller scale disaster, but I often find it helpful to talk to local business owners, because they're invested in their local community, therefore they're invested in seeing people rebuild. None of this occurs in isolation. The economic development and recovery of a jurisdiction and the health of small businesses is very much dependent upon the households existing in that community. So when you think about, 100 years ago when a major disaster occurred, oftentimes you'd see ghost towns pop up afterwards because the community couldn't sustain and they decided to up and move to a new place. Well, now what we see is blight. Now what we see is disaster occurred in the community, I couldn't afford to rebuild, or I'm tired of being hit by disasters, I'm abandoning this property and I'm moving on. And now we have blight. That impacts the tax bracket for that jurisdiction, it impacts the local businesses, and it impacts the economic health and wealth of that community. So all of that is occurring during this phase when folks are analyzing how to support a housing mission. So as we talked about, when the president declares a major disaster declaration and there's a disaster housing strategy implemented, it may include repair and replacement assistance that comes in those form of that FEMA IA money. When a household receives their IA money from FEMA, they get a letter about a week or so later that says, here's how that money is broken down. X amount of dollars is for rental assistance, X amount of dollars is for replacement or rebuild. And it's specifically for the structure. At the state and the federal level, we're looking at vacant rental units, so we're cataloging those and capturing those so that we can provide rental resources to households. The Austin Apartment Association or the Texas Apartment Association or the Austin Realtors or the Texas Realtors, all those realtor associations and rental resources are really helpful to understanding what this capacity is. So pulling in private partnerships as well as public partnerships is very important. And then we may be providing manufactured or alternative interim housing, and this is always a point of last resort. So a housing mission is rare to see. So we had a housing mission for Hurricane Harvey. We had a housing mission in spring of 2016 for the spring flooding. The housing mission prior to that was Bastrop wildfires, and then prior to that we had Hurricane Ike. So if you think about that separation in those housing missions, sometimes there's a larger span between those. So what I like to call long-term temporary housing, because it's not permanent by any means, but we know the reality is this is more of a long-term temporary option. Mobile homes or manufactured homes is one option. Travel trailers is an option. Direct lease was a program we used during Hurricane Harvey where we looked at apartments that aren't traditionally on the apartment rental list, so corporate apartments or extended stay sort of living environments, Airbnb, all those type of housing options. If FEMA could do a contract with those property management companies, then we would put households in those units as well. That served really well in the larger metro areas of Houston, Harris County, as well as Beaumont, primary areas for that. Dollar is what we call during Hurricane Harvey the direct assistance for limited home repairs. If you think about the STEP program or PREPS program we talked about, this is what I call PREPS on steroids. So this is where we actually do finish your kitchen with complete set of cabinetry. It's not your high-end cabinetry. It's not granite countertops, but it is a complete kitchen. It is a much more finished, furnished home in that sense, as far as fixtures and so forth. And it's up to $60,000 in repair to the house. This cannot be completed on households that have structural damages. So the challenge to that is if you are missing a wall or roof or something like that, which in a wind event or hurricane we saw a lot of roof damage, dollar may not work, and that's where we put manufactured homes or travel trailers. And that's why having multiple options in a housing mission is so essential, because it's not a one-size-fits-all for each household. And then there are alternative options. So we cataloged a series of those, and we're working with FEMA to get some of those approved for forthcoming missions. We continue to research those. So there is the 3D printed home, some of you may have seen. It's using a 3D printer to print a cement home. You have to still pour a slab foundation, but that home can be built in about 24 to 48 hours once the slab is down. There are things called casitas or Rapido, or the list goes on, at container homes and so forth. There's so many options out there, so we want to make sure that that's still an option on the table, because again, it's not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to long-term temporary housing. Typically, this housing mission is 18 months from the date of disaster declaration. This is the big confusion. A lot of households will say, well, I didn't get mine for a couple months after Harvey. It's from 18 months from the date of disaster declaration, with the option for the state to explore an extension of that program if it's warranted. While households are in mobile homes, travel trailers, or direct lease, those temporary structures, not the dollar program, but those temporary structures, they're meeting with a recertification caseworker every month to make sure that they're making progress on rebuilding, to make sure that they're making repairs, and to make sure that they're not damaging the unit they were provided temporarily. So we have teams out in the field still to this day who are meeting with households every month to make sure that this is happening. If the household was a renter prior to Harvey, then they actually meet with them every 2 weeks, and they're providing them rental resources and so forth. So there's a lot of interaction with households and a lot of conversation during this time. It can be overwhelming for our households too, because they're meeting with a recertification caseworker on a regular basis. They're meeting with the preventive maintenance team on a monthly basis. And then they might be meeting with their disaster case manager through HHSC during this time too. So they have lots of folks that they have obligations to meet with during this phase. But that's ensuring that they're making progress and not getting stuck in a phase, and also not putting in the effort. As I mentioned a little while ago, avoid the rush to replace housing. This is the pitfall we walk into sometimes. There may be rezoning, remapping that happens a year and a half later, and the last thing we want to do is completely rebuild just to knock it down. So when there is a considerable loss of housing, there are some things to consider for jurisdictions. And these are things to think about later and to put into plans, but the first question to ask is this still the best place for a housing development? Do we rebuild in this area? Do we even allow folks to rebuild here? If infrastructure is destroyed, can replacement housing be planned in a new neighborhood that can be laid out more sustainably? So think about if all the power lines are down and all the sewer systems are gone, do we want to rebuild the infrastructure as well as the housing there? And then examine what happens in the next disaster. Are we building back more sustainable homes, or are we building them back to what they were prior? And now they're just going to be vulnerable when the next storm comes. And then thinking about those mitigation efforts, and can we mitigate the efforts to prevent damage to that neighborhood in the future? Think about city or community ordinances or zoning plans, engaging those partners. So not just acting in an emergency management or recovery isolation, but engaging partners across the board who are planning for those communities to make sure that that planning thinks about resilience and mitigation. And then again, what other zoning needs might have to happen in the future to better improve and get us through this intermediate phase. So we're going to start on part 4. We're going to talk about long-term housing, and then we're going to do a wrap-up, and we should be finished for the day. So long-term recovery housing. We talked a little bit on the break about CDBG-DER, Community Development Block Grant. There are 3 out there. There is Community Development Block Grant, which is every day. There is Community Development Block Grant Disaster Relief, and there's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery. So what we're going to talk about today is CDBG-DER, the disaster recovery one. So as far as housing assistance, again, I'm going to say insurance till I turn blue in the face, because hopefully we get the message across that folks have got to get insurance. I know it can be challenging. I know that folks say, I applied for flood insurance and they told me I didn't need that. Hopefully that myth goes away. Just because your house is not in a flood zone or a floodway doesn't mean you don't need flood insurance. I think we've seen that over and over again throughout the state and throughout the country. Again, we're going to talk about Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery, the importance of planning studies for jurisdictions as well as mapping. We don't do housing in isolation of other areas within disaster recovery or emergency management. So the goal of housing recovery is to help survivors repair or replace their housing, get them back into their homes. And it's also, as I mentioned earlier, a means to revitalize the tax base for the jurisdiction. That brings stronger tax revenue into the jurisdiction. It brings more resources available then for education, for first responder services, and other community services. So it is twofold because you're helping both the health and wealth of the economics of the community as well as the individual households. Back to disaster recovery, CDBG-DR. CDBG-DR can encompass multiple areas. We think of CDBG-DR as just housing, but when a federal disaster declaration is written, there's also a request to HUD for an allocation for CDBG-DR funds. That allocation has to be appropriated by Congress, which can take the time of Congress appropriating something. I'll say that. Then comes writing a state action plan. That action plan is typically 300 to 400 pages in length, if not longer. And it tells the story of the disaster, but then it also explores the housing need for the community, all the demographics, past studies, and so forth. Then there's time for public comment. So it has to be published and up on the website for all of public to comment, not just public comment of those within the state, but it could be nationally or internationally. Each comment has to be responded to. And then those all have to be turned into HUD. And then HUD determines how the state's going to actually administer that program. So each disaster is different. So in one disaster, the state may administer the program. Texas General Land Office currently administers it. They may administer it and have subgrantees be the councils of government or regional planning commissions assist in that administration as subgrantees. Or HUD might come back and say, no, we want you, the state, to run it. For Hurricane Harvey, HUD came back and said, State of Texas, we want you to run the money. However, we are giving a specific portion of the allocation to Harris County and a specific portion to the city of Houston. So HUD makes that determination. It's not made at the state level nor at the local level. The whole process from receiving the allocation through the action plan and then through all the layers that it goes through before you actually begin administration of the program can take a year to two. So that's why we're talking long-term recovery. We are talking the years after disasters occur. And it's just the length of those processes. Hurricane Harvey, we saw a shorter time frame. The leadership from GLO submitted a request for CDBG-DR the same day President Trump came to visit during Harvey, so did Secretary Carson. And they submitted that request that day. And that's what really expedited it. If you look at the other disasters that occurred around the time of Hurricane Harvey, Florida, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, some of those areas, they have not begun their CDBG-DR program yet. We have homes being built right now. So there's a difference in timeline depending on how quick you get your request in and you begin that process. So ICA is closing right now. Also, the allocations for the 2015 and 2016 floods, all of those 5 events just hit at the same time we got the Harvey money. So we're actually administering 6 programs at the same time. So that's a little different too. So it is a lengthy process. And this is what's confusing to the public. It's what's confusing to jurisdictions is how long it takes to recover from a disaster. You know, we say years and everybody nods their head like, yeah, I get that. The reality is I don't think they get the intense nature of how long that really is. So we began swinging hammers in December. First 2 houses began in December for Hurricane Harvey. So in Hurricane Harvey, you have the homeowner assistance program, and that includes repair, rebuild. There's going to be a reimbursement program that just kicked off 2 weeks ago. There's over 2,000 applicants already. That is for those households that have already completed their repairs. They received this amount of money from FEMA. Maybe they received X amount of money from their insurance company, and they had to pay out of pocket maybe, I'll do a round number, $20,000. They apply for the reimbursement program and they show proof. This is how I spent my FEMA money. Here's how I spent my insurance money. And here's the remaining receipts that I have. The GLO has the onus to look at duplication of benefits between all the other programs that might be out there. And they provide that reimbursement process if that household is approved for that. So then there's also the multifamily program where it's building and or rehabbing multifamily properties. We know that that is a lacking resource within some of our jurisdictions. So then there's also infrastructure programs. Those infrastructure programs have to be tied back to housing. So you have to show the connection between, you can't just do a water treatment plant without a connection to the housing program that's being worked for CDBG-DR. And CDBG-DR aims at low to moderate income households, and there's a certain percentage that has to be met for that. Then there's also planning studies. So there are a number of planning studies that have already been conducted, but again, as we talked earlier, you have to understand what's the trajectory of the jurisdiction and the state as a whole. What are some of the hazards that exist out there? Let's study those and come up with best practice recommendations. Now here's the benefit to CDBG-DR is you can build bigger, better, stronger. You can use it for mitigation approaches or resilient approaches, as opposed to FEMA funds that have to be used for PA funds that have to be used what the pre-existing damage was or existing condition. So you have to think about the difference between those two programs. CDBG-DR for Harvey can also be used towards the match for some of the programs on the FEMA funded program side. So they're a benefit to both programs and they complement each other. And then there are a lot of mapping and resilience planning studies that go out there that kind of aim at the future. There's also a buyout and acquisitions program. So similar to the mitigation program that has buyouts and acquisitions, CDBG-DR also funds buyouts and acquisitions. They're then managed at the local level. So that's one thing that the locals do manage is their buyout and acquisition programs. So this is all that long term. This is the years that it takes to rebuild housing. And this is why it's so complicated, because FEMA funds and CDBG funds are funds of last resort. So the federal government wants to make sure that individual households as well as jurisdictions are exploring all funding options and resources prior to tapping into FEMA funds and then CDBG. And when we get into CDBG-DR funds, again, we're also looking at duplication of benefit or duplication of effort. So we don't want to duplicate something that's already been funded by insurance, something that was paid for by other federal funds or resources. So we want to have it something new and that hasn't been covered just yet. So in thinking about long-term recovery, I think we talked about one of the big challenges is getting that message across, helping folks understand how long-term recovery really is, and helping to explain that in layman's terms. We're good about using our lingo, but how do we send that message out to the public? How do we put into our disaster recovery plans some of these other issues that come up, like when do we rebuild, how do we rebuild, mitigation, resilience. Messaging ties into some of the challenges that we face. So having proper messaging, coordinating with external affairs partners, PIOs, social media personnel is absolutely essential. And then thinking about what happens when back-to-back disasters occur, especially in the state of Texas. We know the next disaster is around the corner, we just don't know when. And so always being prepared for that next disaster and still able to close out these previous disasters. And that's what really catches a lot of people is you get moving on something and then all of a sudden another disaster occurs. For individual households, and we think about housing, the real damage to this comes is subsequent disasters that impact what they've already rebuilt. So for example, in 2016 floods, I conducted damage assessments in April of 2016 in Fort Bend County. In May, we went back to Fort Bend County and the household that was using their funds from the flooding event in 2015 had a stack of drywall outside. They were getting ready to rebuild. The 2016 floods came and ruined all their drywall. Well, technically, those materials aren't being used in the home, in the primary place of residence at the time of the disaster, so therefore they're not covered in the new FEMA IA funds. So that's not considered damaged material because it wasn't in use at that time. So that's a real hardship for that household that is now facing back-to-back disasters. So we have to think about it on the scale of a governmental level, but we also have to think about it on an individual household level and the impact those back-to-back disasters might have, especially in a long-term recovery and rebuild. So starting from the beginning, we've covered the different phases of disaster. So we're going to think about starting at preparedness now. Housing concerns, everything with recovery starts at preparedness. What are the steps we need to take to build strong recovery plans, strong housing recovery plans? How do we message? How do we get the information out to individuals ahead of time so that people do have insurance, so that they do have established civic organizations or voluntary organizations that can aid? How do we make sure that people are mitigating and building resilience into their community? Because then when disaster strikes, we're now into that short-term recovery and disaster housing phase, and then we move into the intermediate, which we covered, and then we just covered the long-term. So we have to back it up to preparedness. We have to back it up to resilience and mitigation in order to really achieve all of these phases and all the challenges that these phases provide. So first and foremost, insurance is number one. Get folks insured. Can I say that one more time? Number two, resilience is essential. So we have to build resilience in our communities, into our structures, into our plans. We have to figure out ways to mitigate, because we do know that we're so prone in this state to disasters. We have to figure out ways to improve on that. We have to establish strong messaging and setting clear expectations. If we tell folks disaster recovery housing might take a year or two, it may not be our ideal message to give, but it's a realistic message. Folks will know what to expect instead of assuming that tomorrow their house is going to be rebuilt. I think in the day and age of HGTV, we all think a new house off the grid can be built in a half hour, right? I can't build anybody a house off the grid in a half hour, right? Not with all the contractors in the world. So we have to set the message appropriately. We have to share with folks that this is going to be a long process, and it takes a community effort. It also has to be a message that this impacts your community. So it's important for the local jurisdiction leadership to be invested in disaster housing rebuilding, because it impacts how the rest of the economic health of that community is. It's also important to message there may not always be a federal declaration. And as I mentioned earlier, there really may not be a federally declared housing mission. Those are few and far between. Also, strong relationships with voluntary agencies are absolutely essential. As we went back to the IA slide, we talked about the importance of having voluntary efforts on the beginning, and we talk about it at the very end. Because still to this day, we have long-term recovery groups in our communities that are looking at unmet needs within the households that are still trying to rebuild. It would not happen. Those long-term recovery committees are all volunteers. They all have full-time jobs, and they come together in the evening and on the weekends to figure out how do we help people rebuild. We still have youth groups coming down and adult church and civic organizations coming in on spring breaks and during the summer to help people rebuild. These efforts will continue to go on, so developing those relationships with our voluntary agencies, including these partners in the planning process for a housing mission as well as into the recovery plans, is absolutely essential. They are a key partner. Thanks y'all for participating. Hopefully you got something out of it, and hopefully everyone else will too. Thanks.